Who was Churchill, and how did Churchill come to power at this moment?
Well, Churchill is this absolutely towering figure in British politics, who's been, his first a minister in the kind of noughties of the 20th century and the first years of the 20th century. First of the Liberals, then of the Conservatives. He's a former Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's a towering figure, but he's been in the wilderness because he's out of favour with the Stanley Baldwin government. He's out of favour with Chamberlain, but he is this towering figure, and he has been very outspoken as a backbencher, which basically means, you're not a minister, you're not in the cabinet, you're just an ordinary member of parliament. But obviously, you're an ordinary member of parliament, but you're also an ordinary member of parliament who has had ministries of state and who is this towering figure. So he's listened to in a way that other backbenchers aren't. And he has been saying, we need to stand up to the dictators. We need to do this. We need to rearm more heavily, and blah, blah, blah. So when war is declared, he's brought back into the Admiralty in charge of the Navy, which is Britain's senior service. And suddenly he's there. And what happens is Britain doesn't really do anything. It's very difficult working with France because France is so politically fractured that they can't make any decisions. When you can't make any decisions, you're just impotent. And so Churchill first mentions going into Norway and mining the leads. So the idea is that you're making life very difficult for the Germans to get iron ore out of Sweden. Their main source of iron ore is up in the northern part of Sweden in the Arctic Circle. It then goes on a railway through northern tip of Norway and then gets shipped down the west coast of Norway into Germany, into the Baltic. So Churchill suggests in September 1939, why don't we mine the leads, which are these passageways out of the fjords in the north into the North Sea. Why don't we mine those and stop the Germans from taking this? And everyone goes, well, yeah, that's quite a good idea, but they can't decide, and French are nervous that if they do that, the Germans will retaliate and bomb France and all this kind of stuff. So no decision is made until kind of April 1940. They go up to start mining the leads on exactly the same day that the Germans invade Denmark and Norway. And so they're caught off guard. And at that moment, really, it's seen as a failure of Chamberlain's government. And there is a kind of a mounting realization that no matter how good he was or competent he was as a peacetime prime minister, he's not a wartime prime minister. He's not served in the armed forces himself, doesn't really understand it. It needs a different set of hands. And his government falls on the 9th of May. It becomes inevitable that he's going to have to resign. And the obvious person to take his place is Lord Halifax, who is in the House of Lords, but you can still be a prime minister. And he is, without question, the most respected politician in the country. He's former Viceroy of India. He's seen as an incredibly safe pair of hands, man of resolute, sound judgment, etc., etc. But he doesn't want to take it. He feels physically ill at the prospect, doesn't want this responsibility. He's also not really a military man. He's got a slightly sort of withered hand, which has prevented him from doing military service. And he just blanches at this moment. And that really leaves only one other figure that could possibly take on this position, and that's Churchill. So when Chamberlain resigns on the 9th of May and Halifax says it's not for me, the only person who's going to slip into that position is Churchill, and he becomes prime minister, and he accepts it gladly. He feels like it is his mission in life. This is his moment. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. But he comes with a huge amount of baggage. I mean, he's known as a man who drinks too much, whose judgment hasn't always been great. He was chancellor during the time of the General Strike, 1926. He backed Edward VIII over the monarchy crisis when the king wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, the divorcee, Catholic divorcee, etc., etc. So, his judgment has been brought into question. He is the man who came up with the idea of the Gallipoli campaign, which was, an ignominious failure, blah, blah, blah. So there are issues over him. He is seen as a hothead and a man who doesn't have the kind of sound judgment of Halifax. So the jury is very much out. And I think it's one of those things where you have to put yourself in, you have to look at this through the prism of what people were thinking in May 1940. Yes, he was considered a towering politician, but he is seen also as a loose cannon and by no means the right person in this hour of darkness. And it is coincidental that the 10th of May, 1940, when he takes over as prime minister, he becomes prime minister, not through an election, but by default, of a new nationalist government. So no longer a conservative government, but a nationalist cross-party coalition government for the duration of the war, which includes, members of the Liberal Party and also the Labour Party, as well as conservatives. That it is by no means certain that he's going to be able to deliver the goods. And it is also coincidentally the same day that the Germans launch Case Yellow, Operation Yellow, the invasion of the Low Countries and France. So these are tumultuous events, to put it mildly. And it is also the case that, only a couple of weeks before, Paul Reynaud has taken over as prime minister of yet another coalition government in France from Daladier. So political turmoil is very much the watchword at this time for the Western democracies, just at the moment that the Germans are making their kind of, their hammer strike into the West.
This might be a good moment to bring up this idea that has been circulating recently, brought up by Daryl Cooper, who hyperbolically stated that Churchill was the, quote, chief villain of the Second World War. To give a good faith interpretation of that, I believe he meant that Churchill forced Hitler to escalate the expansion of Nazi Germany beyond Poland into a global war. So Churchill is the one that turned this narrow war, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland, into a global one. Is that accurate?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, not least because the decisions over Poland were made by Chamberlain's government, not when Churchill was out of government. So, Churchill wasn't even involved in that decision-making process at the time. No, I don't think so. I mean, again, I go back to kind of Britain's position in the world in 1939. If you say we are going to defend the sovereignty of Poland and then you don't, that looks really bad globally. Britain's prestige would plummet, would lead to all sorts of problems. You are saying that you're giving carte blanche to dictators to just run amok and take whatever territory they want. You are risking a future upheaval of the global order, away from democracies into the hands of dictators. In the West, people believe in democracy and believe in the advancement of and freedoms of people. It's just, to echo the words of Roosevelt in August 1941. They're aspiring to a world free of want and fear. Now, obviously, there's still some issues with the form that democracy takes in the 1930s. It's not democratic for everyone. Try saying that if you're in Nigeria or India or whatever, or if you're in the black southern states of the United States. But the aspirations are there, and I think that's an important distinction. And I think by saying that Churchill is the chief warmonger of the Second World War, I think is ludicrous. It's the same thing about the bombing. The detractors of strategic air campaign always go, yeah, but Germans had the Holocaust, but weren't the Allies just as bad, just killing all those civilians? It's like, no, because the moment Hitler stopped the war, the bombing would stop. The moment the war stopped in Hitler's favor, the killing would continue and be accelerated.
So the thing you mentioned initially is the sort of the idealist perspective of, well, Britain can't allow sort of this warmonger to break all these pacts and be undemocratic, murder a large number of people and do conquest of territory. Okay, that's idealistic, but if we look at the realist perspective, what decisions would minimize the amount of suffering on the continent in the next 50 years? So one of the arguments that he's making, I happen to disagree with it, to put it mildly, is that Churchill increased the amount of suffering. So Churchill's presence and decisions. So we're not talking about idealistic perspective. We're talking about a realist, like the reality of the war, of Stalin, of Hitler, of Churchill, of France and FDR. did Churchill drag Hitler into a world war? Did he force Hitler to invade the Soviet Union? Did he force Hitler to then invade, attack Britain?
Well, no, because Hitler was always going to invade the Soviet Union unless the Soviet Union invaded Germany first. So that was always going to happen. No one asked Hitler to invade the Low Countries and Norway and Denmark and attack Britain. He does that, of course, because he's not given a free hand in Poland. But there's no question that Hitler would have also wanted to subdue France, or certainly turn France from a democracy into a totalitarian state as well. I'm absolutely certain about that.
So I think there's pretty definitive evidence. I mean, it's obvious from everything he said, from everything he's written, from everything everywhere, that he was going to invade the Soviet Union, no matter what.
Yep.
And France, most likely, yes, also.
He would have done a deal with Britain. Britain could have coexisted.
So actually, there is a possible reality. I don't know. Maybe you can correct me on this, where Hitler basically takes all of Europe except Britain.
Yes, but then he would have got so strong that he would have then turned on Britain as well, because he would, the fear is that if you let him do this, then he gets greedy, he wants the next one, then he wants the next one, then he wants the next one, and, then he wants to take over the whole world. That is the fear of the British. That is the fear of the Americans. That's the fear of President Roosevelt, who's got we haven't even touched on this yet, but he has a very difficult case on his hands, because he's come into power also in January 1933 as president of the United States on an isolationist ticket, with a retrenching, with a kind of sort of, step away from the European old order. It's time for the Europeans to start on their own. It all sounds very familiar right now. And suddenly he's got to do this gargantuan political volte-face and prepare the nation for war, because he also fears, like Churchill fears, like Chamberlain feared as well, that Hitler's designs are not purely on Eastern Europe and the Lebensraum there, but would get ever bigger. And I don't doubt that they're right. I think if he'd prevailed in the Soviet Union, he'd always wanted more, because his whole concept is the master race,
Yeah, I think it should be said, if we measure human suffering, if there was not Britain on the other side, if it was not a two-front war, that the chances of Hitler succeeding in the Soviet Union is much higher, or at least a more prolonged war, and there would be more dead, and more enslaved, and more tortured, and all of this.
Yes, and ditto if if the Allies hadn't got involved against Imperial Japan, it would have been catastrophic. I mean, 20 to 30 million Chinese dead anyway, with American and British intervention. What's it going to be in China without that? I mean, and elsewhere, because the reason why Japan invades French Indochina, now Vietnam, and Hong Kong, and Malaya and Singapore and so on, and Burma, is because it's not winning in China and it needs more resources because it's resource poor, and America has cut off the tap, so it's going into these countries to get what it needs. It's rubber and oil and natural resources and ores, precious ores, and all the rest of it. And if it had been unchecked, it would have done so, and then it would have absolutely built up its strength and overrun the whole of China with even more deaths. So, I think one of the interesting things about the Second World War is lots of wars and why people get involved in them are extremely questionable. But I think there is a moral crusade to the Allies and what they're doing that I think is entirely justified. What I think is interesting also is that as the war progresses, if the Allies are supposed to be on the force of the good, how come they're doing so much bad? And at what point is doing bad stopping you from doing good? And at what point are you doing good but also doing bad at the same time? Such as destruction of cities, destruction of monasteries on outcrops in southern Italy, destruction of killing of lots of civilians, etc., etc. These are difficult questions to answer sometimes, they're also incredibly interesting. And I think that moral component starts to blur a little bit by kind of middle of the war, by 1943. It's kind of easy to have a fairly cut and dry war in North Africa, in the deserts of North Africa, where the only people getting in the way are a few sort of Bedouin tribesmen or something. But once you start getting into Europe or getting into the kind of the meat of highly populated countries in the Far East, for example, that's a different kettle of fish, because the scale of destruction is absolutely immense. But it is also the job of political leaders to look after and defend their own peoples first and foremost. And so what you're doing is you're trying to protect your own sovereignty, your own people, before you're protecting other people. And so that's what leads to, the whole way in which the Western allies are protracting war is to try and minimize the number of deaths of their own young men as much as they possibly can, whilst at the same time winning the war. And that means bringing lots of destruction to your enemies, but also trying to minimize it. And the way you bring lots of destruction to your enemies is by using immense firepower and this concept of steel, not our flesh, which I mentioned earlier on, and technology, so that you don't have to bring to bear too many of your young men's lives, and you don't have a repeat of the slaughter of the First World War. So, it is really interesting that in our mind's eye, when we're thinking of the Western Allies and the Second World War, probably the first thing that comes into mind is Americans jumping out of landing craft on Omaha Beach on D-Day, for example. Those are infantrymen. They're the front line. They are the coalface they're the first people going into the fire of the enemy. And we tend to think about guys in tanks, infantrymen with their Garand rifles or, machine guns or whatever. That's what springs to mind. Yet actually they're a comparatively small proportion of the army. So no more than 14 to 15% of any army, Allied army, is infantry. 45% are service corps, service troops, driving trucks and cooks and bottle washers and people lugging great big boxes of stuff. And that's because by that stage, the Allies have worked out the way of war, which is to use what I call big war. This concept of a very long tail, logistics, the operational art, making sure that people have the absolute best you possibly can, great medical care, huge advances in first aid and medical care of troops, getting them back onto the battlefield. And you're using firepower and technology and mechanization to do a lot of your hard yards. So, that's the principle behind strategic bombing. If you go over and bomb and you can destroy infrastructure and civilians and households, that makes it much harder for Krupp to make those Panther tanks and Tiger tanks or whatever it might be, and guns. And you're disrupting the transportation system in Germany. You're making life difficult for them to do what they need to do, then that means it's going to be easier for those 15% of infantrymen who've got to jump out of landing craft to do their job. And you're trying to keep that to a minimum. And you'd have to say, broadly speaking, that's a very sensible policy that makes an awful lot of sense. The consequence of that is a huge amount of destruction. And maybe that's what Daryl Cooper's driving at. But no one asked Hitler to invade Poland. I mean, that is the bottom line. No one asked Germany to go to war. No one asked Hitler to come up with these ludicrous ideology.
Yeah, there's complex ethical discussions here about just like as you described,
which are fascinating.
And war is hell, and there's many ways in which it is hell. Just for a little bit, the steel man, what Daryl is, where he might be coming from, is since World War II, the simplistic veneration of Churchill, sort of saying Churchill good, Hitler bad, has been used as a template to project onto other conflicts to justify military intervention. And so his and other people like libertarians, for example, resistance to that overly simplistic veneration of somebody like Churchill has to do with the fact that seems to be by neocons and warmongers in the military-industrial complex in the United States and elsewhere, using Hitler way too much, using Churchill way too much to justify invading everywhere and anywhere.
I do agree with that. I think oversimplification of anything is a mistake. Life is nuanced. The past is nuanced. It's okay to be proud about certain things, and it's okay to be disgusted by other things. That's absolutely fine. We have a complicated relationship with our past. It doesn't need to be black and white. And life is not a straight line. And of course, the Allies make plenty of mistakes in World War II. Overall, I think they made the right calls. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is I think that the Allies, for the most part, used their resources much more judiciously and sensibly than the Axis powers do. And, good, because that means they prevail. I think, there are so many lessons from World War II that could have been brought into the history of the last 30 years, which weren't, such as, if you decapitate an incredibly strong leader, you get a power vacuum. And if you don't have a solution for that power vacuum, lots of bad elements are going to sweep into that in very quick order, which of course is exactly what happens in Iraq. So, Donald Rumsfeld going, we don't do reconstruction. Well, you freaking well should do. If you're gonna take on this particular challenge, you've got to see it through. That's simply not good enough. It's not good enough to go into Afghanistan and go, okay, we're going to change things around. It's going to be great. All the women are going to have education. They won't have to wear kind of, they won't have to cover up their bodies anymore. Anything goes. We love liberalism. It's great. Let's make Kabul into a thriving city once more. And then suddenly bug out. Because what's going to happen? You're going to undo everything. And I remember being in, this is a bit of a segue, Lex, but I remember being in northern Helmand province back in, when was it? January 2008. And British troops had just taken over an absolute dump of a town called Musakala. And I remember talking to this Afghan guy. He just had all his willow trees chopped down to make room for a helipad that the Allies wanted, which said, they put their kind of surround, those cages with kind of rubble in the protective wall. Is it called HESCO? I think it was called. Anyway, I said to him, what do you think about the British being there? And he just went, he shrugged at me, lifted up his hands and said, well, if they stay, great, but they won't. And he said, if they stay, then brilliant. But he said, I tell you what, he said, Taliban weren't great. They weren't fantastic. He said, but I could leave my purse on a wall and no one would touch it. I could leave it on a wall for a week. No one would touch it. Said, will they bring that kind of order? Will we have peace here? They've just chopped down my willow trees. Thanks a lot. And you're seeing a total lack of understanding of the culture, ethnic differences. You're trying to impose a kind of Western-centric view onto something which is just onto a nation which isn't ready for that. Now, there are ways in which it looked like Afghanistan was starting to kind of emerge, and there was a path. And then, just at the critical moment, the West moves out with catastrophic consequences. What you have to say, though, is that in the West, post-1945, the rehabilitation of Italy, of Japan, of Western Germany was really good. The consequence of all that destruction, all that turmoil, was thriving, high-producing democracies which burst forth into the kind of second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century in pretty good order. So the lessons of the previous generation from the First World War had been learned, even though the scale of destruction, the displacement of people is unprecedented in 1945.